During the afternoon, Andreev came back from the workers' settlement around the factory. First, he went in to see Alexandra Vladimirovna. His sullen face broke into a smile. She had got up that day for the first time. There she was, sitting at the table, her spectacles on her nose, reading a book. He said it had taken him a long time to find the place where his house had once stood. The whole area was nothing but trenches, craters, and debris. Lots of workers had already gone back to the factory, and more were appearing every day. They even had policemen there. He hadn't been able to find out anything about the men who had served in the People's Militia. They were burying bodies every day, and they were still finding more in the trenches and cellars, and everywhere you looked, there were pieces of twisted metal. Alexandra Vladimirovna kept on asking questions. She wanted to know where he'd spent the night, whether it had been a difficult journey, what he'd had to eat, how badly the open hearth furnaces were damaged, what the workers themselves were getting to eat, whether he'd seen the director. That very morning, Alexandra Vladimirovna had said to Vera, "You know, I've always made fun of people's superstitions and premonitions, but for once in my life I feel quite certain that something Pavel Andreevich is going to bring news from Seriotsa." She was wrong. But what Andreev did have to say was still important. The workers had told him that they were getting nothing to eat, no wages, and that the dugouts and cellars they lived in were cold and damp. The director had become a different person. While the Germans were attacking, he had been everyone's best mate, but now he didn't so much as say hello to anyone. And he'd had a new house built for him, a new car delivered from Saratov. "No one could say things are easy at the power station," said Andreev, "but the workers haven't got it in for Stepan Fyodorovich. They know he's on their side." "That's a sad story," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. "But what are you going to do yourself, Pavel Andreevich?" "I've come back to say goodbye. I'm going home, even if I hadn't got a home. I found myself a place in the cellar with some of the other workers." "You're doing the right thing," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. "It may not be much of a life there, but it's all you have." "Here's something I dug up for you," he said, taking a rusty thimble out of his pocket and handing it to her. "I'll soon be going into town myself," she told him. "I want to see my own home on Gogol Street. I want to dig up bits of metal and glass too." "Are you sure you haven't got out of bed too soon? You look pale." "No, I'm just a bit upset by what you've told me. I'd like things on this earth of ours to be different." Andreev gave a little cough. "You remember Stalin's words the year before last, 'my brothers and sisters'? But now the Germans have been defeated, the director builds himself a villa. You can only speak to him with an appointment, and we brothers and sisters are still in our dugouts." "Yes," said Alexandra Vladimirovna, "it's a sad story. And still no news of Seriotsa? He's just vanished into thin air." In the evening, Spiridonov came back from Stalingrad. He had gone out in the morning without telling anyone that his case was to be settled that day. "Is Andreev back yet?" he asked in a brisk, authoritative tone. "Any news of Seriotsa?" Alexandra Vladimirovna shook her head. Vera could see at once that her father had had too much to drink. She could tell by the way he opened the door and took off his coat, by the way he put down the little presents of food he'd brought, by the tone of his questions, and the strange glitter in his unhappy eyes. He went up to Mitya, who was asleep in the laundry basket, and bent over him. "Don't you go breathing all over him," said Vera. "He'll be all right," said Spiridonov. "He'll get used to it." "Sit down and have some supper. You've been drinking, and you haven't had a bite to eat with it. You know what? Grandmamma's just got up for the first time." "Now that really is good news," said Spiridonov. He dropped his spoon into the plate, splashed soup all over his jacket. "Oh dear, you really have had a few too many," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. "What's happened, Stepan? Have you been celebrating?" Spiridonov pushed away his plate of soup. "Oh, you eat that up," said Vera. "Well," said Spiridonov, "I've got some news for you all. I've incurred a severe reprimand from the party, and the commissariat are transferring me to a small peat-burning generating station in the Sverdlovsk Oblast. In a word, I'm a has-been. I get 2 months' salary in advance, and they provide me with somewhere to live. I begin handing over tomorrow. We'll be given enough ration cards for the journey." Alexandra Vladimirovna exchanged glances with Vera. "Well, that's certainly something to celebrate." "You can have your own room, the best room," said Spiridonov. "There will probably only be one room," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. "Well, that will be yours, Mamma." It was the first time in his life that Spiridonov had called her Mamma. There were tears in his eyes, no doubt because he had been drinking. Natalia came in, and Spiridonov changed the subject. "So, what does the old man have to say about the factories?" "Pavel Andreevich was waiting for you," said Natalia. "But he's just gone to sleep." She sat down at the table, resting her cheeks on her fists. "He said the workers hardly have anything to eat at all, just a few handfuls of seeds." "Stepan Fyodorovitch," she asked suddenly, "is it true that you're leaving?" "Yes," he replied gaily. "I've heard the news too." "The workers are very sorry." "Ah, they'll be all right. I was at college with Tishka Batrov. He'll make a splendid boss." "But who will you find to darn your socks with such artistry?" asked Alexandra Vladimirovna. "Vera will never manage." "Now, that really will be a problem," said Spiridonov. "It looks like we'll have to send Natalia off to the Urals too," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. "Sure," said Natalia. "I'll go any time." And they all laughed. And then there was a strained, uncomfortable silence. Alexandra Vladimirovna decided to accompany Spiridonov and Vera as far as Kuibyshev. She was intending to stay for a while with Yevgenia Nikolaevna. The day before their departure, the new director lent her a car. She set off to visit the ruins of her old home. On the way, she kept asking the driver, "Now, what's this? And what was here before?" "Before what?" asked the driver irritably. 3 different strata of life lay exposed in the ruins: life before the war, life during the fighting, and life today. One building had started out as a tailor's and dry cleaner's. Then the windows had been bricked up, leaving small loopholes where German machine guns had been mounted. Now women queued at these loopholes to receive their bread ration. Dugouts and bunkers had sprung up among the ruined houses. These had provided shelter for soldiers, radio operators, and command posts. Reports had been drawn up and machine guns had been reloaded, and now children were playing outside them. Washing was hanging up to dry. The smoke rising up from the chimneys had nothing to do with the war. The war had given way to peace, a poor, miserable peace that was hardly any easier than the war. Prisoners of war were clearing away heaps of rubble from the main streets. Queues of people with empty milk cans were waiting outside cellars that now housed food stores. Romanian prisoners were lazily digging dead bodies out of some ruins. There were groups of sailors here and there, but no soldiers at all. The driver explained that the Volga fleet was still sweeping for mines. In some places lay sacks of cement and heaps of new beams and planks. Here and there, the roads had been newly asphalted. In one empty square, she saw a woman harnessed to a 2-wheeled cart loaded with bundles. 2 children were helping, pulling on ropes tied to the shafts. Everybody wanted to go back into Stalingrad, back to their homes. But Alexandra Vladimirovna was about to leave. "Are you sorry that Spiridonov's leaving?" she asked the driver. "Oh, what does it matter to me? Spiridonov worked me hard. So will the new man. They just sign their instructions and off I go." "What's this?" she asked, pointing to a thick, blackened wall with gaping windows. "Just various offices. What they should do is let people live here." "And what was it before?" "This was the headquarters of Paulus himself. It was here he was taken prisoner." "And before that?" "The department store. Don't you recognize it?" The wartime city seemed to have overshadowed the old Stalingrad. It was all too easy to imagine the German officers coming up from the cellars, to see the German field marshal walking past this blackened wall while the sentries all stood to attention. But was it really here that she had bought a length of material for a coat, or a watch as a birthday present for Marussia? Had she really come here with Seriozza and got him a pair of skates in the sports department on the first floor? People who visit Verdun, the battlefield of Borodino, or Malakoff Kurgan at Sebastopol must find it equally strange to find children playing, women doing their washing, carts full of hay, old men carrying rakes, columns of French soldiers and trucks covered in tarpaulins once passed over fields that are now full of vines. Now there's only a hut, a few apple trees, and some kolkhoz sheep where Murat's cavalry advanced, where Kutuzov sat in his armchair and ordered the Russian infantry to counterattack with a wave of his tired hand. Nakimov stood on a mound where now there are only chickens and a few goats searching for blades of grass between the stones. This is where the flash bombs described by Tolstoy were launched, where English bullets whistled and wounded soldiers screamed. Alexandra Vladimirovna found something equally incongruous in these queues of women, these small huts, these old men unloading planks, these shirts hanging up to dry, these patched sheets, these stockings twirling about like snakes, these notices pasted over lifeless facades. She had realized how flat everything now seemed to Spiridonov when he had talked about the arguments in the district committee over the allocation of cement, planks, and manpower. She had sensed how bored he was by the endless articles in Stanitskaya Pravda about the clearing away of rubble, the cleaning up of streets, the construction of new public baths and workers' canteens. He had only come to life when he talked about the bombing, the fires, the visits of General Shumilov, the German tanks advancing from the hilltops, the counterfire of the Soviet artillery. It was on these streets that the war had been decided. The outcome of this battle was to determine the map of the post-war world, to determine the greatness of Stalin or the terrible power of Adolf Hitler. For 90 days, one word had filled both the Kremlin and Berchtesgaden: Stalingrad. Stalingrad was to determine future social systems and philosophies of history. The shadow of all this had blinded people to the provincial city that had once led a commonplace, ordered life. Alexandra Vladimirovna asked the driver to stop, then got out of the car and picked her way with some difficulty through the debris that still littered the deserted street. She stared at the ruins, half recognizing the remains of houses. When she came to her own home, she found that the wall facing the street was still there. Through the gaping windows, her far-sighted eyes could make out the light blue and green walls of her flat. But the rooms had no floors or ceilings, and there was nothing left of the staircase. The bricks had been darkened by flames. Here and there they had been scarred by splinters. With a terrible clarity she was aware that all that life had been for her, her daughters, her unfortunate son Seriozza, her many irrevocable losses, her present homelessness, there she was, looking at the ruins of her home, an old, sick woman in an old coat and trodden-down shoes. What was in store for her? Although she was 70 years old, she had no idea. What was in store for the people she loved? Again, she had no idea. Through the empty windows of her house, she could see the spring sky looking down at her. The lives of those close to her were unsettled, confused, full of doubts and mistakes, full of grief. What would happen to Lyudmila? What would be the outcome of her family troubles? Where was Seriozza? Was he even alive? And how hard things were for Victor Strum. What would happen to Vera and Stepan Fyodorovich? Would Stepan be able to rebuild his life again and find peace? What path would Nadia follow, that clever little girl who was so difficult and so kind-hearted? And Vera? Would she be broken by the hardships and loneliness she had to endure? And Xenia? Would she follow Krimov to Siberia? Would she end up in a camp herself and die the same death as Dmitri? Would Seryozha forgive the state for the deaths of his innocent mother and father? Why were their destinies so confused, so obscure? As for those who had been killed or executed, they were still alive in her memory. She could remember their smiles, their jokes, their laughter, their sad, lost eyes, their hopes and despairs. Mitya had embraced her and said, "It doesn't matter, Mama. Please don't worry yourself about me. There are good people even in camp." And there was young Sonia Levington with her dark hair and the down over her upper lip. She was declaiming poems with a fierce gaiety. There was Anya Strum, as pale and sad as ever, as intelligent and full of mockery. And young Tolya, stuffing down his macaroni cheese. She'd got quite annoyed with him for eating so noisily, for never helping Lyudmila. "Is it too much to ask for a glass of water?" All right, but why ask me? Why don't you ask Nadia?" "And Marussia. Xenia always made fun of your preaching, and you tried so hard to make Stepan into a good, right-thinking communist. And then you drowned in the Volga with little Slava Beryozkin, and old Varvara Alexandrovna. And Mostovskoy. Please explain to me, Mikhail Sidorovitch." Heavens, what could he explain now? All of them had been unsettled. All of them had doubts and secret griefs. All of them had hoped for happiness. Some of them had come to visit her, and others had just written letters. And all the time, in spite of the closeness of her large family, she had a deep sense of her own isolation. And there she was, an old woman now, living and hoping, keeping faith, afraid of evil, full of anxiety for the living and an equal concern for the dead. Here she was, looking at the ruins of her home, admiring the spring sky without knowing that she was admiring it, wondering why the future of those she loved was so obscure and the past so full of mistakes, not realizing this very obscurity and unhappiness concealed a strange hope and clarity, not realizing that in the depths of her soul she already knew the meaning of both her own life and the lives of her nearest and dearest, not realizing that even though neither she herself nor any of them could tell what was in store, even though they all knew only too well that at times like these no man can forge his own happiness, and that fate alone has the power to pardon and chastise, to raise up to glory and to plunge into need, to reduce a man to labour camp dust, nevertheless, neither fate nor history, nor the anger of the state, nor the glory or infamy of battle has any power to affect those who call themselves human beings. No, whatever life holds in store, hard-won glory, poverty and despair, death in a labour camp, they will live as human beings and die as human beings, the same as those who've already perished. And in this alone lies man's eternal and bitter victory over all the grandiose and inhuman forces that ever have been or will be. Vera and Alexandra Vladimirovna were in a state of feverish anxiety during the whole of the last day. As for Spiridonov, he had been drinking since early in the morning. Workers were continually coming round and demanding to see him, but he was always out. He was sorting out his remaining affairs, calling at the Raycom, ringing up friends, having his papers stamped at the military commissariat, talking and joking as he walked round the workshops. Once, when he found himself alone for a moment in the turbine room, he pressed his cheek against a cold flywheel and closed his eyes in exhaustion. Meanwhile, Vera was packing up belongings, drying nappies over the stove, preparing bottles of boiled milk for Mitya, and stuffing bread into a bag. She was about to part forever with both Viktorov and her mother. They would remain forever alone. No one here would ask after them, or spare them so much as a thought. She was steadied by the thought that she was now the oldest in her family. She was calmer now, more reconciled to hardship than anyone else. Looking at her granddaughter's tired, inflamed eyelids, Alexandra Vladimirovna said, That's the way things are, Vera. There's nothing more difficult than saying goodbye to a house where you've suffered. Natalia had promised to bake some pies for the journey. She had gone off that morning, laden with wood and provisions, to a woman she knew who still possessed a proper Russian stove. There she began preparing the filling and rolling out the dough. Her face turned bright red as she stood over the oven. It looked young and extremely beautiful. She glanced at herself in the mirror, laughed, and began to powder her nose and cheeks with flour. But when her friend went out of the room, she wept into the dough. In the end, her friend noticed her tears. "What's the matter, Natalia? Why are you crying?" "I've grown used to them. She's a splendid old woman, and I feel sorry for Vera and her little boy." Her friend listened attentively and said, "Nonsense, you're not crying because of the old woman." "I am," said Natalia. The new director promised to release Andreev, but he wanted him to stay on for another 5 days. Natalia announced that she'd stay till then, and then go back to her son in Leninsk. "And then," she said, "we'll see how things go." "What will you see?" asked Andreev. And she didn't answer. Most likely she had been crying because she couldn't see anything at all. Andreev didn't like his daughter-in-law to show too much concern over him. She had the feeling that he still hadn't forgiven her for the quarrel she had had with his wife. Spiridonov came back towards lunchtime. He told them all how the workers in the machine room had said goodbye to him. "Well, there's been a real pilgrimage here," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. "At least 5 or 6 people have come to see you." "Well, is everything ready then? The truck will be here at 5 sharp." He gave a little smile. "We can thank Batrov for that." His affairs were all in order, and his belongings were packed, but Spiridonov still felt a sense of nervous, drunken excitement. He began redoing the bundles, moving the suitcases from one place to another. It was as though he couldn't wait to be off. Then Andreev came in from the office and asked, "How are things? Has there been a telegram from Moscow yet about the cables?" "There haven't been any cables at all." "The swine! They're sabotaging the whole thing. We could have had the first installations ready for May Day." Andreev turned to Alexandra Vladimirovna and said, "You really are foolish, setting off on a journey like this at your age." "Oh, don't worry yourself. I've got 9 lives. Anyway, what else can I do? Go back to my flat on Gogol Street? And the Paters have already been round here. They're about to start the repairs for the new director." "That lout! He could have waited 1 more day," said Vera. "Why is he allowed?" asked Alexandra Vladimirovna. "Life has to go on." "Well, is lunch ready? What are we waiting for?" asked Spiridonov. "We're waiting for Natalia and her pies." "We're going to miss the train waiting for those pies," he grumbled. He didn't feel like eating, but he'd put some vodka aside for their final meal, and he did feel like a good drink. He also very much wanted just to go and sit in his office for a few minutes, but it would have been too awkward. Batrov was having a meeting with the heads of the different shops. The bitterness he felt made him still more desperate for a drink. He kept shaking his head and saying, "We're going to be late, we're going to be late." There was something agreeable about this fear of being late, this anxious waiting for Natalia. He didn't realize that it was because it reminded him of times before the war, when he'd gone to the theatre with his wife, and then too he'd looked constantly at his watch and repeated anxiously, "We're going to be late." He very much wanted to hear something nice about himself. This need made him still more depressed. "Why should anyone pity me?" he moaned. "I'm a coward and a deserter. Who knows, I might even have had the cheek to expect a medal for the defenders of Stalingrad." "All right then, let's have lunch," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. She could see that Spiridonov was in a bad way. Vera brought in a saucepan of soup, and Spiridonov got out the bottle of vodka. Alexandra Vladimirovna and Vera both said they didn't want any. "So, only the men are drinking," said Spiridonov. "But maybe we should wait for Natalia." At that moment Natalia came in with a large bag and began spreading her pies out on the table. Spiridonov poured out full glasses for Andreev and himself, and half a glass for Natalia. "Last summer," said Andreev, "we were all eating pies at Alexandra Vladimirovna's home on Gogol Street." "Well, I'm sure these will be every bit as delicious," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. "What a lot of us there were on that day," said Vera. "And now there's just you, Grandmamma, and me, and Papa." "We certainly routed the Germans," said Andreev. "It was a great victory. But we paid a price for it," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. "Have some more soup. We'll be eating nothing but dry food on the journey. It'll be days before we see anything hot." "No, it's not an easy journey," said Andreev, "and it'll be difficult getting on the train. It's a train from the Caucasus that stops here on its way to Balashov. It's always crammed with soldiers. But they will have brought some white bread with them." "The Germans bore down on us like a storm cloud," said Spiridonov. "But where are they now? Soviet Russia has vanquished them." He remembered how not long ago they could hear German tanks from the power station, and how those tanks were now hundreds of kilometers away. Now the main fighting was around Belgorod, Chugayev, and Kuban. But he was unable to forget his wound for more than a moment. "All right, so I'm a deserter," he muttered. "But what about the men who reprimanded me? Who are they? I demand to be judged by the soldiers of Stalingrad. I'm ready to confess all my faults before them." "And Mostovskoy was sitting right next to you, Pavel Andreevich." But Spiridonov wouldn't be diverted. His resentment welled up again. He turned to his daughter and said, "I phoned the first secretary of the obkom to say goodbye. After all, I am the only director who stayed on the right bank through the whole of the battle." But his assistant, Barulin, said, "Comrade Pryakin's unable to speak to you. He's engaged." As though she hadn't even heard her father, Vera said, "And there was a young lieutenant, a comrade of Collier's, sitting next to Seriotza. I wonder where he is now." She wanted so much to hear someone say, "Who knows? Maybe he's alive and well, still at the front." Even that would have consoled her a little. But Stepan Fyodorovitch just went on with his own thoughts. "So I said to him, 'I'm leaving today, you know that very well.' 'All right then,' he said, 'you can address him in writing.' To hell with them all. Let's have another drink. We'll never sit at this table again." He turned to Andreev and raised his glass. "Don't think badly of me when I'm gone." "What do you mean, Stepan Fyodorovitch? We workers are on your side." Spiridonov downed his vodka, sat quite still for a moment, as though he'd just surfaced from under the sea, and then attacked his soup. It was very quiet. The only sound was Spiridonov munching his pie and tapping away with his spoon. Then little Mitya started screaming, and Vera got to her feet, walked over to him, and took him in her arms. "You must eat your pie, Alexandra Vladimirovna," said Natalia, as though it were a matter of life and death. "Certainly," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. With drunken, joyous solemnity, Spiridonov announced, "Natalia, let me say this in everyone's presence. There's absolutely nothing to keep you here. Go back to Leninsk for your son, and then come and join us in the Urals. It's not good to be on one's own." He tried to catch her eyes, but she lowered her head. All he could see was her forehead and her dark, handsome eyebrows. "And you too, Pavel Andreevich. Things will be easier for us if we stick together." "What do you mean? Do you think I'm going to begin a new life at my age?" Spiridonov glanced at Vera. She was standing by the table with Mitya in her arms, crying. For the first time that day he saw the walls of the room he was about to leave. Everything else became suddenly of no importance. The pain of dismissal, the loss of the work he loved, his loss of standing, the burning shame and resentment that had prevented him from sharing in the joy of victory. The old woman sitting next to him, the mother of the wife he had loved, and now lost forever, kissed him on the head and said, "It doesn't matter, Stepan, my dear. It doesn't matter. It's life." The stove had been lit, the previous evening, and the hut had felt stuffy all night. The tenant and her husband, a wounded soldier who had only just come out of a hospital, didn't go to sleep until it was nearly morning. They were talking in whispers so as not to wake up the old landlady or the little girl who was sleeping on top of a trunk. The old woman was unable to sleep. She was annoyed by all this whispering. She couldn't help but listen. She couldn't help but try to link together the odd phrases she overheard. If only they'd talk normally, then she'd just listen to them for a little while and fall fast asleep. She wanted to bang on the wall and say, "What's all this whispering about? Do you really think what you're saying is that interesting?" She kept making out odd phrases here and there. "I came straight from the hospital. I couldn't get you any candies. It would have been another story if I'd been at the front. And all I had to give you was potatoes fried in oil." And then the whispering became inaudible again. Probably the woman was crying. Then she heard the words, "It's my love that kept you alive." "I bet he's a real breaker of hearts," thought the old woman. She dozed off for a few minutes. She must have been snoring, and when she woke up, the voices were louder. "Pivovarov wrote to me in hospital. I'd only just been made a lieutenant colonel, and now they're putting me forward for promotion again. It's the general's doing. He put me in command of a division. And I've been awarded the Order of Lenin. All for that day when I was buried under the ground. When I lost touch with my battalions, and all I could do was sing stupid songs, I kept feeling as though I'm an imposter. I can't tell you how awkward I feel." Then they began whispering again. They must have noticed that the old woman was no longer snoring. The old woman lived on her own. Her husband had died before the war, and her one daughter lived in Sverdlovsk. She didn't have anyone at the front herself. She couldn't understand why she had been so upset by this soldier's arrival. She didn't much like her tenant. She thought of her as a stupid, empty woman who couldn't cope on her own. She always got up late. She didn't look after her daughter. The girl went around in torn clothes and never ate proper meals. Most of the time, her tenant seemed just to sit at the table, looking out of the window and not saying a word. Now and then, when the mood took her, she did get down to work, and then it turned out she could do everything. She sewed, washed the floors, made excellent soup. She knew how to milk a cow, even though she was from the city. Something was obviously wrong in her life. As for the girl, she was a strange little brat. She loved messing about with grasshoppers, cockroaches, and beetles. She didn't play with them like ordinary children. She was always kissing them and telling them stories. And then she'd let them go and start crying, calling for them to come back. Last autumn, the old woman had brought her a hedgehog from the forest. The girl had followed him wherever he went. He only had to give a little grunt, and she was beside herself with joy. And if he went under the chest of drawers, she'd just sit there on the floor and wait for him. She'd say to her mother, "Shh, can't you see he's asleep?" Then the hedgehog had gone back to the forest, and the little girl hadn't eaten for 2 whole days. The old woman had lived in constant fear that her tenant was going to hang herself, and that she'd be left with the little girl. The last thing she wanted at her age were new anxieties. "I don't owe anyone anything," she'd say. She couldn't rid herself of this anxiety. One morning she was going to wake up and find the woman hanging there from the ceiling. What on earth would she do with the little girl? She had been quite certain that the tenant's husband had abandoned her. Probably he'd found another younger woman at the front. That was why her tenant was always so sad. She got very few letters from him, and those she did get didn't seem to make her any happier. And she was a real clam. It was impossible to get a word out of her. Even the neighbours had noticed how peculiar she was. The old woman had had a hard time with her husband. He was a drunkard, and a very quarrelsome one at that, and instead of just beating her like anyone else, he used to go for her with a stick or a poker. He used to beat their daughter too. And he wasn't much joy even when he was sober. He was always fussing and poking his nose into her saucepans, complaining about this and that. Everything she did was wrong. The way she milked the cow, the way she made the bed, the way she cooked. It was impossible for her to put her foot right. He was a miser, too, and he cursed and swore the whole time. In the end, she had become just as bad herself. She even swore at her beloved cow. She hadn't shed one tear over her husband when he died. He hadn't left her alone, even when he was an old man, and he was quite impossible when he was drunk. He might at least have tried to behave in front of his own daughter. She felt ashamed to think of it. And how he had snored! That had been even worse when he was drunk. And as far as that cow of hers, the obstinate beast was always running away from the herd. How could an old woman ever keep up with her? She listened to the whispering behind the partition and remembered her own difficult life with her husband. She felt pity as well as resentment. He had worked hard and earned little. They'd never have got by without the cow, and it was the dust from his mind that had killed him. But she hadn't died. She was still going strong. Once he had brought her some beads from Yekaterinburg. She had passed them on to her daughter. Early next morning, before the little girl had woken up, the tenant and her husband set off for the next village. There they'd been able to buy some white bread with his army ration card. They walked along hand in hand without saying a word. They had to go 1.5 kilometres through the forest, climb down the slope, and then walk along the shore of the lake. The snow there hadn't thawed. Its large, rough crystals were filled with the blue of the lake water. But on the sunny side of the hill, the snow was just beginning to melt. The ditch beside the path was full of gurgling water. The glitter of the snow, the water, and the ice on the puddles was quite blinding. There was so much light, it was so intense, that they seemed almost to force their way through it. It disturbed them, and got in their way. When they stepped on the thin film of ice over the puddles, it seemed to be light that was crunching under their feet, breaking up into thin, splinter-like rays. And it was light that was flowing down the ditch beside the path, where the path was blocked by stones. The light swelled up, foaming and gurgling. The spring sun seemed to be closer to the earth than ever. The air was cool and warm at the same time. The officer felt as though his throat, which had been scorched by frost and vodka, which had been blackened by tobacco dust, fumes, and swear words, had suddenly been rinsed clean by this blue light. Then they went into the forest, into the shade of the young pine trees. Here the snow hadn't melted at all. There were squirrels hard at work in the branches above. The icy surface of the snow was littered with gnawed fir cones and flakes of wood. The forest seemed silent. The many layers of branches kept off the light. Instead of tinkling and gurgling, it was like a soft cloak swathed round the earth. They walked on in silence. They were together, and that was enough to make everything round about seem beautiful. And it was spring. Still, without saying anything, they came to a stop. 2 fat bullfinches were sitting on the branch of a fir tree. Their red breasts seemed like flowers that had suddenly bloomed on enchanted snow. The silence was very strange. This silence contained the memory of last year's leaves and rains, of abandoned nests, of childhood, of the joyless labour of ants, of the treachery of foxes and kites, of the war of all against all, of good and evil born together in one heart and dying with this heart, of storms and thunderbolts that had set young hairs and huge tree trunks trembling. It was the past that slept under the snow, beneath this cool half-light. The joy of lovers' meetings, the hesitant chatter of April birds, people's first meetings with neighbours who had seemed strange at first and then become part of their lives. Everyone was asleep. The strong and the weak, the brave and the timid, the happy and the unhappy. This was a last parting in an empty and abandoned house with the dead who had now left it forever. Somehow you could sense spring more vividly in this cool forest than on the sunlit plain. There was a deeper sadness in this silence than in the silence of autumn. In it you could hear both a lament for the dead and the furious joy of life itself. It was still cold and dark, But soon the doors and shutters would be flung open. Soon the house would be filled with the tears and laughter of children, with the hurried steps of a loved woman, and the measured gait of the master of the house. They stood there, holding their bags, in silence.